November 17, 1944, dusk over the Philippine Sea. The sky burned crimson and gold as Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada banked his Mitsubishi A6M0 through the cooling air above Leyte Gulf. The engine coughed, a familiar sound now, the wheeze of machinery stretched beyond its design, fueled by ersatz gasoline, cut with pine root extract and prayer. Through the oil-smeared canopy, he counted them. 1, 5, 12, 23 American aircraft rising from the carrier decks below like locusts erupting from furrowed earth. More than he had bullets, more than he had fuel to chase, more than seemed possible for any nation to build, crew, and launch in a single afternoon. He keyed his radio transmitter, his voice flat with a resignation that transcended fear. Mugen, he whispered, infinite, endless. The word Japanese pilots had begun using in their debriefings, their journals, their final letters home. Not a military assessment, a theological declaration. They were not fighting an enemy anymore. They were fighting an idea made manifest in aluminum and rivets, a demon of production that consumed ore and spat out wings faster than bullets could tear them down. What Takeshi Yamada reported that evening would ripple through the Japanese Naval Air Service command structure like a tremor before an earthquake. Not panic, exactly. Recognition. A crystallization of something the Empire's strategists had suspected since Midway, but had lacked the language or the courage to articulate fully. By late 1944, Japanese pilots were no longer filing combat reports. They were filing testimonies of the impossible, the promise and the doctrine. 4 years earlier, in the winter glow of 1940, the young men of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service trained beneath a doctrine of supremacy. They were told, and they believed, that the Mitsubishi Zero represented the apex of fighter design, lightweight, maneuverable, lethal in the hands of a skilled pilot. They trained for 18 months where American pilots trained for 6. They studied Bushido, the way of the warrior, and they studied aerodynamics, gunnery, navigation, with a single-minded intensity that bordered on religious devotion. The mathematics of war seemed favorable. Japan possessed superior pilots, superior aircraft, and the unshakable will of a people unified under divine purpose. American forces, they were assured, were fractured, decadent, too soft for prolonged sacrifice. The war would be short. The Americans would negotiate. They always did. Then came December 7, 1941, and the skies above Pearl Harbor erupted in flame and triumph. Japanese aviators returned to their carriers, exhilarated, vindicated. The reports were spectacular. 8 battleships sunk or crippled, hundreds of aircraft destroyed on the ground, the American Pacific Fleet shattered in a single morning. Sake flowed in the officers' quarters that night. Toasts were raised to the Emperor, to the inevitable victories ahead. In those heady hours, no one paused to consider what would happen when the sleeping giant truly woke. The shift. By mid-1943, the reports changed. Not in tone, Japanese military discipline forbade defeatism, but in their stubborn attention to detail. Pilots returning from missions over Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Rabaul began noting serial numbers on downed American aircraft. These numbers climbed not incrementally but exponentially. An F-6F Hellcat shot down in March bore a fuselage number in the low 3,000s. By June, captured wreckage showed numbers in the 9,000s. By September, the 15,000s. The arithmetic was impossible to ignore. Either the Americans had developed a numbering system designed to deceive, or they were producing new fighters at a rate that violated every principle of industrial capacity the Japanese understood. Commander Masatake Okumiya, a veteran of the Pearl Harbor attack and among the most respected tacticians in the Naval Air Service, began compiling these reports with a scholar's obsession. He interviewed pilots, cross-referenced their accounts with reconnaissance photographs, consulted with intelligence officers who analyzed debris from shot-down aircraft. The conclusion grew unavoidable. American factories were not merely replacing losses, they were multiplying their strength. For every Hellcat destroyed, 3 appeared. For every Corsair sent spiraling into the sea, 5 more emerged from the assembly lines in Connecticut, New York, California. Okumiya wrote in his classified assessment, submitted to Admiral Fukudome in October 1943, "We are not engaged in attrition warfare, we are engaged in mathematical obliteration. The enemy does not fight to preserve what they have, they fight knowing they can waste what they build." The symbolism Japanese pilots latched onto was not a weapon or a sound, but a color. Blue. The deep, rich, cobalt blue of American naval aircraft paint. In the early months of the war, seeing that blue was a call to battle, a target to be destroyed. By late 1944, the blue had become something else, a sky-filling tide, an omnipresent blanket that smothered the horizon from dawn to dusk. Pilots described it in their debriefings with the repetition of shell-shocked men. "All I saw was blue. The sky was blue with their planes." The color invaded their dreams, their waking thoughts. It was no longer a paint scheme, it was a prophecy. The evidence accumulates. American production records, declassified decades after the war, confirm what those exhausted Japanese aviators witnessed. In 1941, the United States produced approximately 19,400 aircraft of all types. In 1942, that number surged to 47,800. By 1943, 85,900 aircraft. In 1944, the year Lieutenant Yamada whispered Mugen into his radio, 96,300 aircraft rolled off American assembly lines. That is 264 aircraft per day, 11 per hour. 1 combat-ready warplane completed, inspected, fueled, and shipped every 5.5 minutes around the clock for 365 days. But the numbers alone failed to capture the psychological demolition these figures wrought on Japanese strategic thinking. Japan's entire 1944 aircraft production, counting every fighter, bomber, trainer, and reconnaissance plane produced across the home islands, totaled approximately 28,000 aircraft. The Americans were producing more than 3 times that figure. And the quality gap, once a Japanese advantage, had evaporated. The F-6F Hellcat could outclimb, outgun, and outlast the Zero in nearly every combat scenario. The P-51 Mustang possessed a range that allowed it to escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory and return home. The American industrial complex was not merely large, it was adaptive, innovative, relentless. Japanese pilots captured late in the war, interviewed by American intelligence officers, expressed a bewilderment that transcended language barriers. One pilot, shot down near Iwo Jima in February 1945, asked his interrogator through a translator, "How is it possible? Do you build them underground? Do you have factories we cannot see?" The interrogator, a young lieutenant from Ohio, simply showed the prisoner a copy of Life magazine. The issue featured a photo essay on the Willow Run bomber plant outside Detroit, where Ford Motor Company had converted automobile assembly techniques to aircraft production. The mile-long building, the seas of partially completed B-24 Liberators, the workers, many of them women, riveting fuselages with choreographed precision. The Japanese pilot studied the photographs in silence for several minutes. Then he wept. The transformation of belief. What changed in the minds of Japanese aviators was not courage. They continued to fly missions with fatalistic bravery until the final days of August 1945. What changed was certainty. The doctrine of inevitable victory eroded mission by mission, replaced by a grim determination to delay the inevitable. Diary entries recovered from pilots killed in action during late 1944 reveal this transformation. One entry, dated December 3, 1944, written by a 22-year-old pilot named Hiroshi Tanaka, stated, "Today I saw 40 of their planes. I shot at one. I believe I may have damaged it. Tomorrow there will be 80. We are not fighting a war. We are fighting arithmetic. There is honor in how we fall, but no mystery in that we will. Senior officers, insulated from frontline reality by distance and pride, continued to issue directives premised on tactical brilliance overcoming material disadvantage. But the pilots knew. In the ready rooms of carriers and island airbases, a dark joke circulated among the younger flyers. The Americans do not need to shoot us down. They can simply wait for us to land and realize there are more of them in the air than we have bullets in our ammunition stores. Gallows humor, but rooted in operational truth. By November 1944, Japanese aircraft were often armed with enough ammunition for 30 seconds of sustained fire. American planes carried enough for 2 minutes or more, their magazines fed by an industrial machine that treated ammunition like sand. The recurring blue, that paint, that color, became the motif through which Japanese pilots processed their annihilation. In Shinto tradition, blue represents purity and cleanliness, but also the boundary between the living world and the realm of spirits. To fly into a sky dense with American aircraft was to cross a threshold, to enter a space where the rules of earthly combat no longer applied. Survival was not a function of skill, it was a function of chance, of whether the mathematical distribution of enemy fire happened to miss your particular coordinates in the three-dimensional chessboard of aerial combat. One pilot, in a letter smuggled to his family and recovered after the war, wrote, "When I close my eyes, I see only blue. When I open them, blue. I do not think I will die from bullets. I think I will die from drowning in the sky." The reports themselves. The formal debriefing documents from late 1944, Japanese naval air operations are clinical in language but devastating in implication. Report after report catalogues the same observations with bureaucratic precision: overwhelming numerical superiority, advanced radar-directed interception, robust aircraft capable of absorbing battle damage that would cripple a Zero. One report from the Battle of Leyte Gulf, dated October 25, 1944, notes, "Of 18 aircraft launched, 3 returned. Enemy aircraft encountered, estimated 200 plus. Accurate count impossible due to continuous reinforcement from carrier groups." The phrase continuous reinforcement appears again and again, the military euphemism for an enemy who could lose a dozen planes and have them replaced before the day ended. Saburo Sakai, Japan's most celebrated surviving ace with 64 confirmed kills, wrote in his post-war memoir about a mission in late 1944 over the Philippines. He described achieving a perfect firing position on an American Hellcat, landing multiple hits, watching smoke pour from the engine cowling, and then watching the American pilot calmly maintain course, land aboard his carrier, and presumably walk away to fly another aircraft the next day. "It was then I understood," Sakai wrote. "We were killing machines. They were killing the idea of us." The distinction was subtle but total. Japanese strategy depended on the psychological impact of losses. American strategy accepted losses as overhead, a cost of doing business in the arithmetic of war. Intelligence estimates compiled by Japanese naval intelligence in December 1944 laid out the calculus in stark terms. Even if Japanese pilots achieved a kill ratio of 3-to-1 in their favor, an optimistic projection given the declining experience levels of Japanese aviators and the improving capabilities of American aircraft, the net balance would still favor the Americans due to replacement rates. The report concluded in language as close to despair as military documents permit. The enemy's capacity to replace losses exceeds our capacity to inflict them. Attrition as a strategy is no longer viable. Alternative approaches must be considered. The alternative approach, of course, was the kamikaze doctrine. If you cannot outproduce the enemy, if you cannot outfight the enemy, then transform the pilot into the weapon. One plane, one man, one ship. The mathematics of suicide made a terrible kind of sense in a war where the sky had turned blue with enemy wings. Epilogue. The sky that could not be darkened. In the years after the surrender, after the tribunals and the reconstruction, after the bombed cities were rebuilt and the widows remarried and the generation that fought tried to explain to their children what those years meant, one image persisted in the collective memory of Japanese naval aviators who survived. Not the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, though those were etched in history. Not the signing ceremony aboard the USS Missouri, though that symbolized the formal end. The image that haunted them was simpler, more visceral, a sky so crowded with American aircraft that it seemed impossible a single Japanese plane could fly through it without collision, a sky turned blue by an industrial will that transformed awe into destiny. What Japanese pilots reported about American aircraft production by late 1944 was not merely data. It was the recognition of a new kind of warfare, one where the factory was as decisive as the battlefield, where the assembly line was the ultimate weapon, where the true strength of a democracy lay not in its ideology but in its terrifying capacity to convert belief into matter. They had fought bravely, skillfully, with a devotion to duty that history must acknowledge. But they had fought a war of the past, a war of warriors and codes and honor, against an enemy waging a war of the future, a war of logistics, production quotas, and the cold arithmetic of material science. The blue never faded from those skies. It simply expanded, filled every altitude, every vector, until there was nowhere left to fly that was not under its shadow. In the end, the Japanese pilots did not lose to better tactics or braver men. They lost to a nation that had turned freedom into fuel, democracy into steel, and the assembly line into an instrument of total war. The Zero had been a masterpiece, but masterpieces cannot be mass-produced. And in the vast, indifferent algebra of industrial warfare, one masterpiece means nothing against 1,000 functional copies. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamada did not survive the war. His Zero was shot down 3 days after his Mugen transmission, struck by fire from a Hellcat, flown by a 19-year-old from Kansas who had been in combat for 6 weeks. The American pilot returned to his carrier, filed his report, ate dinner, and flew again the next morning in a different aircraft, a replacement that had arrived overnight on a transport ship from San Diego. The sky remained blue. The war continued. And somewhere, in a factory in America, another plane rolled off the line, nameless and numbered, one more drop in the flood that drowned an empire.